Welcome everyone, thank you very much for coming. We're going to start. I'm not sure how much we need these microphones. When the room is fully packed, it can, sound can disappear a bit, but I'm conscious that the Prime Minister is speaking directly after this, so for those of you who are watching the recording online, that's probably why you're not here. But thank you all very much for coming and making the time. This is the last event that Restate is putting on at Labour Party Conference this year. We've had a very busy programme. It's good to see a couple of frequent flyers, and we will be back next year, so please stay tuned for that. But last but very not least, we're here today in conversation with Kanishka Narayan. Kanishka is the MP for Vale of Glamorgan and also Minister for AI and Online Safety. It very recently confirmed briefs, and he's joining us here today to talk about UK leadership in the future of AI, which is a really exciting conversation to be having. My name's Joe Hill. I'm chairing today. I'm one of the policy directors at Restate. And if you don't know Restate, we're a cross-party think tank. We work on public service reform and state capacity. Kanishka, it's great to have you there, and thank you for doing this. I guess I wanted to start with quite an open-ended question. We're here to talk about AI. It's technology that's changing the world in fundamental ways. And you're very recently Minister at DCIR, which I think of as the sort of the department which is charged with ushering in the future for Britain. And I guess when you think about AI and what it means for our future as a country, what does it make you think?
Great. Can I just do we need these? Yeah. Can I just say a big thank you for everyone who's made time. The Prime Minister's up very shortly, so I know we'll all be rushing very obediently and watching our dear leader give a great speech. So I'm grateful you all made time for this. I feel so grateful to be in this role because I have believed that the central political challenge we have in the contemporary context is to draw a very sharp choice for the British public between people who are painting a picture of both grievance and a mythology of what was, and people who can say that collectively, if we pool our efforts, we invest in our collective potential and we stare at the future directly, the best thing the Labour Party can do is to be the sound of the future arriving. And nothing says that more clearly than a coherent, credible plan and vision on AI. So to me, this is a central thing, not just in itself because the transformative impact of AI will be the central political question in 3 years' time, but because even on the central political question of today, I think this is the dominant theme that is on my mind. And then the specific question is where the UK can, what this can do for that political project. And I think what it can do is effectively not just to do the tactical things that mean the UK is in a good place to both lead globally, but lead in a secure and resilient way. Those things are important, and we're doing a bunch of stuff to execute on the AI Opportunities Action Plan, to get the right scale of infrastructure, to have a degree of sovereign control over that infrastructure, to have salience of that infrastructure in terms of adoption and diffusion, and underpinning that, to have talent in the public and private context. All of those things are really critical. Scale, sovereignty, salience, talent, those are fundamental ingredients. But the big prize, as I think about this, is to paint a story of the journey we're on together as a country, to talk about what is a distinctly British trajectory on AI. We have a feel for the US trajectory on AI, we have a feel for the Chinese trajectory, we have a sense of the Middle East increasingly building a particular trajectory. We have actually a sense of what the French trajectory is on AI. But the task at hand is to paint not just a tactical set of steps, but a strategic vision for why this is something that builds on the heritage we have of amazing ingenuity and research in Britain, of people building great energy generation sources, including my constituency, for decades and decades, and to pool all of that heritage, that history, that pool talent in the direction of what we can do together for the future. And to build that story, I think, is the real prize on offer, because if we do that, not only will we look back sitting here in 2029 and looking at hopefully another Labour victory, we will be able to say that AI and the trajectory we've been on has played a big role in painting that picture of hope, of optimism, and of the future having arrived.
It's fantastic. I wanted to pick you out on a particular word you used, which is sovereignty. And sovereignty, I think, risks becoming a bit of a buzzword in this world, particularly in a world where, not just in technology, but in global supply chains and commerce and in research and the battle of ideas, it's much more interconnected than it was. What does sovereignty mean to you, I guess, particularly in an AI context?
Great. So I have two very specific views on this, but the main thing to say is, as Joe said, I'm 3 weeks into the job, and so I say my beliefs with conviction, but with a clear sense that they are weakly held and very much open to your input. The two feelings I have on sovereignty are as follows. One, there's a very, very specific test, which is when we look in 2028 and 29 and we look back and say AI was the transformative technological innovation of our generation, and not just our generation, but for a much longer span of time, will we be able to say that Britain has made sure that we are not exposed to being choked off critical parts of that supply chain? I think that's a very specific test we can apply in 3 to 5 years' time. And part of that will mean that we have strategic leverage at parts of the supply chain, which mean that we can sit at the table and negotiate and ensure resilience of access. Part of it will also mean that we've been able to adopt and build a sense of diffusion and build some real capability that we're selling abroad as well. So that's a very specific test. Do we or do we not have the ability to have resilient access to core inputs in the AI supply chain? And then the second brief thing I would say is sovereignty is not just meaningful if we do that at a kind of national, international, and geopolitical level. It is relevant if sovereignty is tied to a sense of agency at the community, individual, and organizational level in this country. And that's because it is a sense of agency at that level which drives durability in building a national and international picture and project of sovereignty as well.
And in that supply chain, where you think about the points of our competitive advantage, which we're weaker, where should our focus be? If we're not going to own the whole thing, where's the secret sauce for us?
Well, I mean, that in particular is a question that I have not even weakly held views on, but very little conviction on, because I think it's a question that we have to look into much more detail than I can summon in 3 weeks. But I have some hypotheses on this. One hypothesis is we have to think about possible scenarios and trajectories of AI evolution, and think about not only where the UK can play on the current central scenario, but if you were thinking about this from a venture point of view, what are risk-adjusted bets the UK could be making on a range of scenarios, which kind of places very well. To make that more specific, at the moment we are in a context where we have very high compute intensity frontier models. The UK clearly doesn't have the headquarters of any of those companies. We do actually have a bunch of Gemini researchers sitting in King's Cross. None of them, I've spoken to a bunch of them, and they don't want to move to the US. They are very much here in the UK. So I don't want to write that off. But there's this trajectory of extreme high intensity compute models being developed, and the UK clearly at the model layer is in a position that is distinct from the US. There is also a clear sense that if you look at the semiconductor part of the supply chain, the UK is clearly not a country that has either TSMC, ASML. ARM is actually a material player, and so I think there is some strength there. So there's that kind of trajectory where there are some strengths at the semiconductor level in terms of chip design. There are some strengths in terms of kind of model research, if not fundamental corporate headquarters. And then there's a bunch that we're doing in specific domains: Wave, 11 Labs, Synthesia, GraphCore, increasingly N-Scale. There are lots of things that we're doing. So on that scenario, there are clear sources where we already have strength, and there's a lot more that we can do. But imagine two other scenarios, not as dominant trajectories, but as alternative weightings in this picture. One trajectory in which open source becomes a much bigger part of the overall ecosystem. And then you have a diffusion of talent, a diffusion of possibility, and a much greater ability for the front line of application to be a fundamental part of the means of fundamental production. I think that offers a very different trajectory for where Britain can play, and that really is about pooling the talent and the effort of our communities in developing that ecosystem. A third scenario weighting could be that we have a system where we don't just have compute deployment and cloud hosted deployment of models, but increasingly we have deployment on edge, we have deployment on device. We're building a sense of much greater citizen control in terms of AI deployment as well. And there again, I think the UK can play a really important role in terms of both fundamental kind of parts of the supply chain upstream, but also in terms of being able to develop light models that are pragmatic and being able to deliver a high amount of value for a limited amount of compute intensity. And so the way I broadly think about this is on the current trajectory where we have some strengths, we can double down on them. But the real kind of exam question from my point of view is how we make those risk-adjusted bets across different scenarios for how the world might play out.
Thank you. You talked about risk-adjusted bets, and I just wanted to take us back a sec to just risks kind of writ large. people think about lots of different kinds of risks in AI. What risks do you think we underrate, and what risks do you think we kind of overrate? What do you find yourself saying we're not worrying enough about that risk? Which risks do you think we're spending too much time on?
Yeah, it's easier to answer the former question. So I will start there. I think there are two risks that are really top of mind for me at the moment. One risk is that is the political risk, which is that on the face of it, you ask the British public their views on AI, on technology, on data, on proposals that my department has announced recently, digital identity credentials, and on the surface you will find a picture of concern, of risk, of in some places opposition. And the risk is that the primary fork in the road we have that I've highlighted at the outset, that people grab that and say the British public is not in favor of technological progress and technological innovation. I think that is a fundamental risk, and you can look at it internationally where you're finding the horseshoe of political extremities aligning on this particular question, that the way to tackle technological progress and AI progress is to stop it or pause it. And I think that is a fundamental risk, because it is easy to do that and it is deeply dishonest to do that. And so the challenge for us in the progressive movement is to paint a picture of contextualizing information, to say to people there are legitimate concerns and worries that we have about the impact of labour markets, the impact of privacy, the impact on catastrophic risk and bioweapon risk and so on, but to place it in the context of both where we're coming from, where we have a bunch of those risks. There are lots of firms in this country, relatively recently, some of them have been implicated in situations of cyber exposure, which aren't really the frontier of AI, but they are firms where jobs are being exposed to material risk already. So contextualizing where we're coming from and contextualizing the value we can get is really fundamental in having an honest conversation, and it is on us to be able to make that argument and win that argument. And then the second risk I think about is really the counterfactual risk, which is that we consistently talk about all the downsides of what can happen, and I think it's really important to do that. And Britain has a particular deep and thriving cottage industry in talking about all the possible ways in which things can go wrong. But what we desperately need is an equal and clear-eyed sense of how things can go right. And if I think about one of the big risks in the last wave of software of the last 15 to 20 years, it has been the sense that Britain has completely sat out that entire wave. That the prosperity, if you look at both the aggregate picture and the felt experience and the Vale of Morgan and beyond, but if you even look at the numbers and look at ICT capex, which has been the biggest driver of productivity growth in the United States and has been flat and declining in the UK, we have totally missed out on allowing people across this country a sense of dignity, living standards, and public service quality by missing out on that wave. So the counterfactual risk is top of mind for me. There are very few incentives in it, unless think tanks like yours talk it up and praise people when they get it right and condemn them when they get it wrong. But that to me is a fundamental risk.
I think you're saying that there's a risk of comparative advantage of Britain could be worrying about things, which would be certainly consistent with nothing else. Something you said made me think about where we've historically been in the history of AI to date, but also software. And I think there's a thesis out there, which most people would subscribe to, which is that Britain has become a kind of incubator economy for some of these technologies, that we find ourselves involved in creating and incubating very early stage new technologies and products, but that we don't quite capture some of the kind of benefits of those at scale in companies, in investment, in government, in the public's lived experience. Do you subscribe to that thesis? Do you have a view of what we should do differently, if anything?
Yeah. So yes, but I think the debate has to be very, very nuanced. And if you look at all the different aspects of what we're trying to achieve by having companies at the frontier of technology in this country, one part of it is to get tax revenue. So corporate location is important for that question. It actually will become increasingly important in the AI trajectory if it becomes too small. Another is the location of people, because the ability to have talent ecosystems is a big driver of what you can do more generally in your economy. A third aspect is to have early uptake and diffusion of things that really make a difference to our felt experience of life and living standards. A fourth might be a sense of national security and particular kind of hard conceptions of sovereignty and risk as well. So there are lots of different things we're trying to achieve when we're thinking about what the whole point of a technology sector in the UK might be. And I'm sure there are many others that I've missed. How we do that and where we stand on those is nuanced and varied. So if I take some of them in order, people sometimes make the argument that it would have been amazing to have had DeepMind, for example, invested in by the British state or British companies and to stay here. And I think part of that I kind of feel internally as well. Wouldn't it have been amazing for DeepMind to have been an incredible national champion as well? My mind is not made up on this question, but I'm also very conscious that if I remember the numbers correctly, Google invested 700 million plus on an annual basis over a 10-year period in a company that was keeping up profitable over the bulk of that period. And if I had gone to seek election in the Bailiff and Morgan and said I want to try and spend 700 million every year away from public services in other contexts on a company that may or may not pay out, but trust me to make that bet, I think it would have been a very difficult question. So again, I feel like contextualizing the trade-offs implicit in some of these questions is really important. And on the broad question of corporate location, I do think it's actually really critical if you apply the lens of transformative AI over a 3 to 5 year period. I think to that question, corporate location becomes very important because I'm very interested and concerned about the quality and depth of the tax base that we end up having and where margins accrue and across the supply chain of AI. And we have to capture all of that. But on a backward-looking basis, it is not the dominant concern I hold. The dominant concern I hold is probably focused on talent, because I think there are second-order effects of having the best people in the world do things here, both in the public sector and the private sector. There, I have a particular concern about the spread of opportunity and fulfillment from technology across this country. I think that's a huge area where we haven't gotten things right in the past, and I think we can make a radical difference. Unlike the last wave of software, I think we can have another go at fighting the economics of agglomeration, because I think the inputs are a bit different than this time around. And so I think there are some experiments to be placed there where I think we can do radically better.
I just want to ask you about that point on agglomeration and fighting it. That's a kind of contrarian take on centuries of economic theory. That we might this time round be able to spread the benefits of software outside of London and outside of cities. You said you think the inputs are different this time around, and I'd be interested in why you think.
So this is the wonkiest chat I've had at conference.
Very happy
It's
to
a
pay
badge of honor for Restate. This is great. So here's my faith-based belief, which I hope becomes an evidence-based history at some point soon, which is that in the last 2 to 3 decades, there were obviously big returns to people accumulating in the same places because knowledge, ideas, the ability to be able to learn by doing together was a fundamental driver of what really allowed productivity to take off. And that was really important. It was seen in the software context in particular, and it meant that there were lots of people, especially on one part of the political divide, who were making the argument that the best way to drive prosperity was to bus people from places into other places. I think what we're finding now is 2 things. One, actually, there are lots of glitches in that argument, because it actually has been the case that there are specific locational advantages in niche subsectors, compound semiconductors in Newport, for example, photonics in parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, doing really well in it as well. Gaming in Scotland as well. Bits of fintech spread across Bristol, Leeds, Edinburgh, as well as Manchester and Cardiff, very importantly. And when I look at those examples kind of coming together, they don't kind of just prove that in the aggregate theory, but in between the aggregate there are so many cracks which drive a felt experience of living standards in those places that we have to take that very seriously as part of the story. So I think there's a degree of kind of revisionism about the history that we need to conduct. But the second part is the inputs question is effectively this. If you think about the fundamental inputs into a software SaaS business, the reason those businesses have been huge returners in terms of equity value is because they've been built effectively on ideas, on intangibles, and on zero marginal cost of deploying the cloud. And that has been a hugely powerful force. It is also a force that particularly accentuates the impact of agglomeration. But if you think about AI, what we're finding at the moment is that, of course, at the kind of very outset, land, water, energy become important inputs into compute. And so a lot of the debate is they then saying, hey, if you're building compute here, if you're building people who are building data centers, security around data centers, raising awareness of compute, let's have a go at trying to capture some of the value of that compute in those places. I think that's an important starting point. But even if you throw it forward and you look across the supply chain, there's semiconductors, there's compute, a lot of that margin, I think, is going to sit there. But even if it's commoditized, there's huge markets there which are much more geographically spread by virtue of the inputs. There's then model performance, and that I think still has huge agglomeration benefits because effectively there's a very fat tail thing where the top researchers in AI can drive most of the uplift. We'll see where that goes, but increasingly with open source, I think actually people will be surprised at the level of margin capture there. And then you have adoption. And I think that is the kind of real game in town, because if you think about the benefits, obviously I have a particular bias towards South Wales, but we have this amazing public interest database sale in Swansea University. We have fantastic life sciences research. One of the models that has been able to materially accelerate the pace of Parkinson's diagnosis at Cardiff University. We have a great semiconductor cluster across both Newport and Bristol. Which means that there's a bunch of research, not just in terms of advanced manufacturing, but specifically thinking about wider second order effects of that in terms of manufacturing design, a bunch of other stuff that comes off it. And so even if you just look at that very particular small world of mine in South Wales, you start to think actually the opportunities in applied AI that we can now capture, because they are very, very much opening some of the cracks in the aggregate story, now become actually really fundamental drivers of value. I think that is kind of part of the opportunity set here. And so for those two reasons, the kind of hard bits of compute, but particularly the soft opportunities in very niche domains now becoming radically amplified and accelerated in scale. I think those are the two reasons why I feel like we can have another crack at it.
It's been the wonkiest chat I've had at late past. But thank you for that. We've situated a lot of this in geopolitics, and we're stepped out on a world stage here, which has other big players. I wanted to ask you particularly about our regulatory approach. I characterise the last few years of our regulatory approach in the UK as trying to sort of ride maybe two horses at once between the United States approach and the EU's approach, and that's a similar approach that we've tried to take to maybe online safety. On things like GDPR, we've taken a much more clear cut. So in the history of software, we've had different versions of this, and we still have the cookie banners today. Do you think we will change that approach and we will end up aligning with one block more or the other over the course of our kind of the expansion of particularly frontier AI?
Yeah, I think let me abstract away and do a sort of political thing here of not answering the question you asked me, but the one that I want to answer, which is that I think the one refreshed sense you're seeing in our framework for thinking about regulation is to not apply primarily the lens of geopolitical alignment, but to apply primarily the lens of sovereign objective. And if you start there and say, what is the thing you're trying to achieve in your regulatory framework, enforcement, and communication in any particular domain? If you start in that question, you actually very quickly arrive at a sense the primary lens of thinking about that and optimizing there is not necessarily geopolitical alignment. It's important because, of course, trade is a really fundamental driver of progress in all of this as well. But if you apply that lens and you apply that, say, to the planning context, people still kind of feel like there's the Labour Party has suddenly kind of surprisingly become the party of deregulation. Well, my personal view on this, having sort of something in the environment context, is it is absolutely remarkable to me that our regulatory framework in planning has delivered neither a sense of living standards uplift nor a sense of restoration of nature and biodiversity. We have had a flat picture on productivity, a terrible picture on housing affordability, and we've had a picture of nature being in desperate decline. That is not a regulatory system that is working for any of our sovereign objectives domestically. And some part of that will mean, in some places, cutting regulation that might not work. Actually, in other parts, it will mean building a deep sense of a progressive vision of regulation, which is fundamentally that regulation is not just about law or guidance or statutory instruments or committees. It's about the capability of individuals both coming up with regulation but fundamentally enforcing them. And if you believe that state capacity is a remarkably powerful force for good in the regulatory environment, rather than simply institutional norms that have lasted for a long time and laws that have been around for a long, long time, then I think you can have an answer which is neither European in nature, neither American in nature, but actually fundamentally British in nature, in believing that we have a scale unlike the EU to move fast. We have a welfare and public services context unlike the United States to build values into that. But ultimately, we apply that sense of scale, we apply that sense of value to the objective that we hold specifically in our British context.
I wanted to ask you about diffusing some of those benefits to the whole country, not just to big business or to the software sector. And I'm conscious that one of the many things we confidently expect the Prime Minister is going to say at 2 o'clock is that he's going to announce in the NHS we're going to have a virtual hospital, which is something that our health policy team have campaigned for and argued for a long time. And putting the AI at the heart of public services like this is a really important way of showing the public the benefits. You're not a Minister for Digital Public Services, but you are for AI. How do you think about that kind of trade-off? And also, where's the public sector adoption of this going to be a bit different to what we see in the private sector?
Yeah. So I think the most ambitious vision for public sector adoption of AI is one which effectively brings the frontier of technology to people who have never historically been given and afforded the dignity of being in the frontier of technology. And healthcare is a really compelling example of that. When you talk about a lot of the policy debates we end up having in technology policy, but you make it real for people and talk about drug discovery, that means that a relative would have passed away or would have had a better shot at surviving a disease. When you talk about acceleration of diagnosis, which means that my mum, who's now been managing diabetes for 15 years, would have had a slightly easier time. When you're able to think about it in those concrete terms, I think you're able to build a wider sense of not just trust, which is important as a starting point of the ladder, but the ultimate step on the ladder, which is agency. When people feel like they're able to experience the benefits in a way that's salient to them, I think they feel a bit more confident in then being able to adopt it elsewhere. So I think that's a really critical part. But the fundamental destination here is to say to the British public that the story of our national progress is built on capabilities, not just in a small set of firms thinking about the development of models in particular places. But the way to drive adoption and diffusion is to drive a fundamental sense of what Wong's will call management quality, and what I would call many more of us feeling that we have the capability, the license, and the sense of conviction in deploying this stuff in firms, in our non-profits, in our organizations. And wouldn't it be remarkable if we were able to do this first, not just in the NHS, but in areas like DWP, where fundamentally over a 3-decade period or so, we've collected CV. I think I went to the job centre first when I was 16, gave them my CV. They've got tons of CVs, they've got a bunch of interview data, they've got clear understanding of welfare patterns and income levels. It is right for the frontier of technology to go and service the dignity of people, which the Labour Party was founded to serve. And so on the adoption and diffusion question, I think the two main things I think of is telling the story of salience in people's day-to-day lives, and second, building a sense of capability that we can build this stuff, not just be recipients of it.
And for anyone in the audience who wants to read more about what the Prime Minister is going to say at 2 o'clock on a virtual hospital, you can find our research at www.re-state.co.uk/publications. There are several links there, which will be very helpful.
Have you still got the Reform URL?
I don't think we should discuss it.
Did you sell it to the Reform Party?
Not yet. Not yet.
You're sitting on that cash.
We're hoping to get to the moment of maximum possible coverage. When you were appointed, we wrote you an open letter, which I'm sure you've studied very closely. Deeply. And I wanted to take this chance to ask you specifically about point 3 in that letter. You mentioned, like me, that before this job you were a civil servant and you've worked in Whitehall on the other side of a kind of line that you now find yourself crossing. And we're in the public sector relying on lots and lots of public servants to do that kind of adoption and make the case for those benefits and take the risks you're talking about. And on some of these really big plays about geopolitics, the supply chain, trade, regulation, in Whitehall you're relying on civil servants to help you navigate challenges they never had to before. Do you think the civil service is up to that? And what changes might it need to undergo to do that?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked me about point 3 because it's the one I thought most about. But I think it would be very rich of me in week 3 to make an assessment of the overall civil service. So let me tell you my feeling on what is a shift in perspective and approach to public service reform that I think will be fundamental to the civil service's ability to meet the challenge of this moment. And I think that is the journey that I've been on. I spent the early 4 years of my career thinking about public reform. I was negotiating devolution deals, setting up bits of the GDS, thinking about social impact bonds and financing changes, and then trying to set up a strategy in it in EDS. And all of those were kind of levers for making public services better. And one of the things I've kind of come to feel very strongly is my model of public service reform is that overlaying new technology tools, talent, assessment processes, retention, recruiting, all those things, and ideas on an existing system and going on that journey of business transformation is necessary in some places, but it is not adequate in most places if you're trying to drive fundamental political public service reform. And instead, a better way is to create internal startups and to bring together a totally distinct sense of talent, of technology, of the tools that are available to us, both in technology and finance and operation contexts, and to build something so quickly and so much better that the world moves to you. And to be able to do that within an organization and have the cultural clarity as well as conviction to be able to afford people the license to do that, I think is kind of my preferred model of public service reform now. And so to your question of whether the civil service is adequate or not in meeting that challenge, I think there are clear examples where it has been able to meet that challenge, not just in moments of crisis, like what has happened in parts of the COVID experience, but also in moments peacetime. And I think about so many of those examples, the Prime Minister's delivery unit in the early days, GDS at another moment, actually part of the social impact and investment team, which was able to do some really important things for making a difference on interventions for excluded children and homeless people through financing innovation as well. What has happened in AC, which I'm so passionate about. The only reason we continue to have pre-deployment access increasingly is because of the world-class capability of those people and the license and the cultural context of them. So this kind of model has been something that the civil service has done in the past, and I feel really confident that with that clear sense of conviction and clarity, that this is the path to public service reform we can do. Yeah.
My final question before we go to the audience, so please start thinking of what you want to ask about, is that you have yourself played an important role in this government's job creation agenda. You've become an MP just a little over a year ago. You're now a minister. You also, to your many accolades, are one of the judges of this year's Think Tank Awards. With plenty of prominent, very wonky think tanks might have entered into. And I don't want to bias you, but if you were giving advice, say, on what think tanks could do to support the government in grappling with these big existential questions, many of which we've talked about today, what can we, the community in this room, many others like us, do to help you with these kind of new challenges you're dealing with?
Joe, I'm very sorry to let you down, but my hunch is I'm going to have to recuse myself from the panel in light of recent changes.
Not in light of this conversation,
and perhaps in light consideration of this conversation too. I'm now inevitably biased. I think firstly, I've just found huge value in engagement with think tanks, even in the short period of time that I've been in Parliament, and certainly been in this role. And think tanks in Britain have increasingly been serving a great purpose, not just in terms of shaping the public arguments or the debate around things, not just in surfacing new ideas that people can't think of in the day-to-day experience, but fundamentally as builders of community and talent. And Restate is a great testament to that, and fundamentally that I think is a really important thing, because going back to the question of the primary mechanism of driving public service reform that I was talking about, you have an unbelievably underpriced and underestimated ability to convene people, to give them the conviction when they're in the machine, that they are in a community of like-minded people rowing in the same direction, who will be supported with practical, specific, tractable ideas. but fundamentally that if things go wrong, that it will be a safer and secure landing for them in terms of having a community of supporters, because it is the most fundamental thing that will drive a sense of conviction, of courage, and of agency in themselves.
I'm sure certain think tanks will continue to do that. We're now going to go to questions from the audience, and I'm going to establish some ground rules for what we do, which is I'd really like it if you started your question by just saying your name and the organisation you're from, and nothing else from your CV. I'd really like it if questions were short, and I'm going to hold the line on questions which are statements, not questions. So if you have a statement, this moment your hand should be going down. Fantastic. All right, lots of questions. Okay, so we're going to have to go through these quite quick fire. I'm going to take maybe kind of 2 or 3 in a round, and then we'll kind of play them back. Okay. So in the front row first.
Mark Smith from Deloitte. Just wonder if you have any perspectives on what you see in the business world around the use of AI, the particular sectors that are doing it well, how can they learn from each other, and then how can you kind of draw on that in what you do in the government?
Brilliant. Sorry, and then just in the middle there.
Hi, Cecilia Stromska, General Director in Policy, but co-founder of the Women's Branch of UK AI. My question is around accountability, transparency, and responsible AI. Obviously, in public adoptions, a lot of worry about that. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see a need? Do you think there's scope for the development of a kind of golden standard that the UK can become a global leader in, which could maybe mitigate some of these worries when driving digital transformation?
Fantastic. And then just the gentleman in the corner there.
Hi, Lisa from the AI Works School. Question for yourself, what's the one that's going to drive you in terms of the one area that you're very passionate about when it comes to AI?
Well, why don't we start with that one first? What are you most passionate about? And then we're going to do which sectors are getting it right. Should we establish more of a global standard?
Yeah.
3 big questions.
Can I put it, if there was an award for laying the law down on questions, not comments, then certainly.
I don't think that is one of the think tank awards.
That's about as much as you're going to get from me. But on the thing I'm most passionate about, can I just let me do a quick plug for a campaign that I ran until recently, which was called All Hands on Tech, and there are lots of things we did. A startup accelerator, Dawn Capital did a startup school for kids from the Vale. Lots of stuff, but the flagship thing was a promise to try and get 500 tech jobs in the Vale movement in the next 5 years, 500 internships for kids growing up in the Vale. And we did 17 internships in the last 3 months, a bunch of firms, Amazon, Google. We had a couple of kids engaging with DeepMind, and then we had a bunch of them engaging with people who'd left DeepMind to start startups, so both big and small. We had a couple of non-profits. It was great, and I was sitting in Barry Island in a playground with Josh, who is 19, who worked at a big $200 billion US SaaS firm. It was the first time he'd walked into an office. Josh and I first met at Kirsten's Church near Gibbonstown in Barry, one of the most economically deprived wards in Barry, and as a result, Western Europe. And we sat and had a chat for about 30 minutes, and we had it on video, and Josh talked about the experience of growing up, having sort of become really into gaming as a kid in his house in Barry, and never been in an office, and then suddenly went to school, then didn't feel a great fit, went to college in Barry, and through gaming found that he was interested in some of this stuff, found the opportunity through All Hands on Tech to go and work at a massive US SaaS company in the UK, and said to me, I'm now going to go to university and tell the story of what AI can do in terms of opportunities for kids like me available. And so if we can sit here in 3 to 4 years' time and not just tell the story of social mobility and impact in itself, which is important, but tie that story of what we will often talk about in the progressive movement to a story of fundamentally incredibly chasing the future in a way that makes a difference to our productivity picture. To tie both a sense of the social mobility story to the sense of productivity, that to me is the real price. So if people like Josh can be not just great examples that we talk about in an HR leaflet, but can be CEOs who are driving a global sense that the UK is the frontier of AI. I think that to me would be the biggest prize offer and the thing I'm most passionate about. Are we going in reverse order? So should I take the... Great. So responsible AI and gold standard. I think this is a really deeply important question because it is important both in itself for moral reasons, and it's important to build trust and agency and adoption and diffusion as well. Again, 3 weeks in, I'm not going to preempt what the right kind of lever is in terms of standard versus regulation versus product design versus showing standards through building rather than telling people the standard through legislating. Very open on what the right lever is. But the one outcome that I think will be really compelling is a world in which we're able to say that things that we did in Britain meant not only that private developers of AI and adopters of AI were able to do that in a much more responsible way that built trust, that meant we moved faster as a result of building trust, but that also we were able to show through the use of AI that we spotted areas of irresponsible AI deployment or technological deployment. To give you a very specific example, one of the things I think about very deeply is if you think about biases in healthcare diagnosis or in credit underwriting. In healthcare diagnosis, I was talking in UKI last night about this, but for a long period of time, African American individuals in the United States kept going to the doctor with pain in the knee, osteoarthritis. They said, I'm experiencing very intensive pain. The doctor got the pain scale out and said, your pain is below the surgical threshold and it's in the threshold of opioid prescription. People kept coming back and said, I'm kind of really still in pain, I've done the whole opioid thing, more opioid. And over time, that wasn't because of AI deployment, that was because the training data set for human assessment of pain came from the 1960s and 70s in Lancashire, not from the experience of African American people in the United States. The use of AI uncovered that bias, found on a longitudinal basis that those people were experiencing a higher level of felt experience of pain, which ought to have qualified them for surgery rather than excessive prescription of opioid, and has led to a fundamental shift in that context. That wouldn't have happened without the application of AI. A very similar thing, by the way, applies in underwriting, where increasingly we're finding that it is the thinness of data used in underwriting rather than the application of AI model performance that is driving a lot of biases and exclusion of people from accessing credit. So that is not the generalized story. There is no generalized story, but I think that the potential here is not just to do writing by standards for how to do AI deployment, but also to deploy AI in figuring out where our human organizations' decisions are currently being kind of extending a sense of bias and discrimination. And then I think your question was kind of what can we learn from businesses and sectors that are doing well in terms of AI adoption. Quite a lot. So one thing that I'm finding quite interesting. Let me just sort of say two anecdotal things on this. One, the last wave of software and software as a service was very interesting because the primary mode of adoption in enterprises was not big top-down procurement at all times, but often very consumerized, i.e. people individually saying, hey, I kind of use this and it's really easy for my task, and so can I then spread this? So Stripe very famously as a payments company took that go-to-market approach and others did too. What we're seeing in AI is that kind of radically turbocharged. And one thing I always find very enjoyable is that if you look at the number of people in businesses in the UK who say that they use ChatGPT or similar in their work, and you compare that to the number of licenses that the businesses have, there's a 20 percentage point gap. And so this kind of shadow tech adoption world that is happening very radically in business is an interesting and instructive, I think, in understanding how adoption will ultimately play out in organizations, both in business and private and public contexts, which are able to run with consumers who are not going to wait for you to go and run that procurement process, but will do what is right by them in terms of their expectations in their private lives. I think that is kind of a really interesting way to think about it. And then, the second thing I think about is there are clearly some sectors, actually primarily those who have historically also used a lot of tech, but some really great manufacturing businesses. So Renishaw, for example, is a great British business building some really important parts of the semiconductor supply chain and beyond. And the way in which those organizations have reorganized themselves in terms of pace to retain headcount, but to apply a very high degree of automation is really instructive to me, because it tells me that there isn't an inevitability right now in whether AI ends up being human augmenting or substituting, but there is agency on that much. And if we can learn that lesson There are some concerning parts to that. So, for example, we're finding that organizations are spending much more of their apprenticeship levy on retention of long duration talent rather than the entry of new talent, and so that creates opportunities for young people. But if we can find some of those great examples of reorienting yourself so that you're not stopping or pausing in the adoption of AI, but to do that in a jobs-rich way, which retains the dignity of people and builds their experience, I think that those examples are really compelling.
So, I'll take a few more questions. The gentleman there, maybe about it, and then gentleman below that.
It's Dan Guthrie from the Alliance for Intellectual Property. You have to mention copyright, obviously. But from a positive point of view, is there an opportunity for the UK to have a competitive advantage by having models that are properly copyright compliant, responsible, so therefore there is no legal liability, and therefore they are easier to sell and buy, and therefore that kind of responsibility, and does that offer us a competitive advantage if they are compliant with copyright?
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So India is something from Chatham House, and we've actually also certificate thank you so much for this conversation. I want to ask about energy policy and tech policy. So you made this case for making sure that we had strategic parts of the AI supply chain here in the UK, and it made a very compelling case. But data centers, apart from that, have very high energy demand. And I wondered if you could talk about how you see a way through or way to reconcile our net zero targets, our energy targets, and our goals on tech and tech.
Question, yeah, and finally, about
Thank you. Richard Marlett from Valex PLCs. We're a UK FTSE 10 company that's developing AI solutions, Elsevier, LexisNexis. Similar question to Dan's, and picking up on the question you asked about EU regulation. Is there anything to learn from the AI Act, especially with regard to making sure that large language models and other developers are taking authentic data in, and that will help build trust in the use of those AI solutions?
We're really testing your ask that we don't think of all the things that could block us from AI, and instead think of you can do whatever order, but we have is copyright a comparative advantage? Are our AI goals and our net zero goals compatible? And can we learn from the AI Act?
Great. So on, if I take the first and the last together, I'm afraid I'm not going to preempt any of our policy decisions on either copyright or thinking about our regulatory path and legislative path. It has been my mission at conference to not end up on the pages of any media institutions. So, please don't let me down on my last day. But let me say one thing that I think can be a really important driver of comparative advantage for Britain in the realm of intellectual property, which is that fundamentally, I think if Britain becomes a place where people on both sides of the bargaining table are able to strike the most number of licensing deals and feel a appropriate sense of value, I think that will have been a remarkable outcome. Part of that is about the regulatory question of who has power when they turn up to the table. Is it opt-in or is it opt-out? And that makes a difference. The party which has historically always thought about the significance of who holds power in collective bargaining, it is clearly an important question. But I think as important as the question of who has power is the question of what material basis do they have to try and strike a deal. Because most economic activity is not either fully opt-in or fully opt-out, but is to find a price at which you can appropriately and in a specified way opt-in. And so the exam question that I'm interested in, as much as the regulatory question, is the question of when you have models which take billions of data inputs, and most people, either in the creative sector or the intellectual sector, are one small part of that billion data point rich data set. The marginal value, the individual value of each contribution is very hard to estimate, and we will estimate it. It's close to zero in many contexts. That is not a satisfactory position, because most individuals, not collectively large organizations, but most individuals will find it very difficult to get the right value, even if we end up with clear regulatory outlook at the table. And so the thing I'm most interested in is how we develop ways in which we can pool the ability of people to be conducting those licensing collective bargaining processes and to underpin those with a material and analytical base that gives them a good sense of their value. And so that is the kind of primary thing I'm interested in. There, you'll on the energy question as well. Look, there are specific ways in which we have to make sure that we are hitting our two primary missions. One being that we want to drive a sense of prosperity and productivity in this country. And you don't have to look very far to know that AI capital investment is going to have to be a really fundamental part of that. And at the same time, we have a really important clean power mission to make sure that we lower bills, we create jobs, and we build national resilience. That is the mandate on which we were elected. I think there are two things that I think about in this context. One, I think there are some ways in which you can places in which you can bust the trade-off by making sure that AI capital investment serves as a demand side and a financing source for renewables build-out. And I think if we can get that right and do that alongside a series of reforms we're doing on planning and grid reform, I think we'll actually find that we've been able to find the overlap rather than the conflict and the trade-off. And two, big picture, abstracting out, the thing I think about on clean power and our climate initiatives more generally is that even if you look at electricity demand, you look at kind of our energy demand over the course of the next 10 to 20 years, I'm sure AI will play a part of it, and it's always easy to underestimate the demand side for technology. But everything we might end up doing on electric vehicles, everything we might do on wider kind of renewables infrastructure will radically trump that. And I think even in the most optimistic scenario, it appears to be these numbers may well be totally wrong specifically, but directionally are right. I think AI demand will go at most from or compute demand, cloud demand as well. So not just AI, will go maximum kind of 2% to 4% of electricity demand in this country over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. And so the exam question is, yes, how do we get this right in the AI context? But that's just a pocket. The thing we've got to get right is how do we apply AI to solve the bigger problem? And I think there's huge potential in being able to do that by making our energy build out more efficient, more prompt, and more intelligent.
Fantastic. We're getting a few questions at a rapid rate, which is absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Can we take another answer? The lady there, and then far back right.
Hi there, I'm Megan Pennell from Rethink Mental Illness. So my question is around mental health, as you can imagine, and we're already seeing huge numbers of people who, because of the kind of long waiting list for mental health support at the moment, particularly young people turning to AI chatbots for mental health support, and already when they're testing it, seeing ways that they can hide those behaviours from their family or healthcare teams. But there's also huge potential. So there's opportunities to reduce those waiting lists really quickly. We can train AI as a kind of preventative tool to pick up signs of kind of disorder eating or mental health problems before they come to concerning. So my question is, I guess, how can we balance that? Because there's huge potential but huge risks, particularly in the context of mental health. And how can the third sector and the private sector and government work together to kind of get ahead of it?
And then the gentleman there.
Tommy from the Centre for Long-Term Resilience. So I just want to come back to this point about the UK's comparative advantage, and you mentioned how successful the UK AI Security Institute has been. So I'm just curious if you think that security and safety can be a potential technological opportunity for the UK as well, and startups and businesses looking to make the UK more secure, and that can be where we can have a comparative advantage in the staff.
And then, yeah, Pat.
Mike Bergstall from the AI Institute. You talked about the potential for public concern around AI, but there's an analogous risk of concern from doctors who are ending up with a lot of the risk that's passed down with commercial liability or through regulatory tension. So what do you think, any early thoughts on what the government might be able to do around ensuring that businesses feel safely off?
Great. So on the mental health question, the honest answer to this is I think this is a huge problem and challenge for us, and I have very few specific prescriptions. But the way I think about this is there are clearly aspects of what's going wrong that we have to look at. One of the things I'm very concerned about is the pace and amplification of synthetic content, which is extremely hard to enforce against online, just makes the regulatory enforcement challenge just like radically different to anything we've experienced before. And one of the reasons why I was really proud that the Secretary of State within 3 weeks has made both self-harm content and cyber flashing priority offences is because I clearly feel that there are specific areas in which we need to do a much better job of prioritising action against harms on social media platforms. And so there's that question. There's this broader thing which I think we're still probably at the very earliest stages of understanding, which is the dynamic and overall societal impact of social media and synthetic content in particular on the experience of mental health, of loneliness, of our ways of relating to each other, our ways of believing in particular disinformation. So both specific offences as well as a more general societal impact, I'm curious about and think is a huge priority, but don't have huge prescriptions on. And on your question about ways of working together, I think there'll be loads and loads to do. But one area which in particular I'm interested in is I often find in technology policy that policy ought to be downstream of product rather than the other way around. As in, what is something that we can do together to build into product design standards, product design itself, to make products ourselves, rather and to build stuff rather than just kind of regulate stuff, and show what can be improved through doing that. And there, I think there are particularly strong opportunities for collaboration across civil society, non-profits, public sector, and private sector talent as well. Question, Tommy, you asked me about security as a source of comparative advantage. I think it can be a really significant source in a couple of different ways. One, and again, I'm using the ambiguity of security to plug into it all the things that I want to plug. But national security is clearly a very important area where we have made clear fiscal commitments around ring-fencing parts of the budget, uplift for drones and AI deployment. And I think that can be a pretty significant part, not just in terms of the spend in the MOD, but actually upstream as well in R&D spend as well. The second order effects of defence research spending historically, both in this country and abroad, have been very material. And so I think that can be a real important source of comparative advantage, both within the sector and for its impact more widely. I think I remain a really proud champion for the work of the AI Security Institute, and I know increasingly it is relied on both by governments that we're allies with, by firms and the labs, but also a wider set of organisations. As we go through both far greater build-outs, physical build-outs in terms of data centres, but also model adoption and organisational rollout, I actually think those two areas, one of thinking about the security aspects of compute and core parts of the supply chain upstream of model, I think that's a really interesting and important area where we can build even deeper comparative advantage. And then certainly being able to think about pre-deployment, security assessments, evaluations, assurance, that entire market, I think will be really critical as well. And increasingly, the kind of puck is moving from pre-deployment evaluation to kind of post-deployment mitigation as well, given open source. And so there's a lot that we can do, there. Michael, on your particular question, you're going to have to remind me. So, can you?
So, as well as the risk of the public.
Oh, corporate liability. Yeah.
What about businesses worried about the risk they're taking on from adoption?
Yeah. Really important question, and I'm afraid I'm going to take the liberty of being 3 weeks in to also say that there's a question that I think is significant. I have a couple of directions of interest in this, but not a specific prescription set. One area that I'm interested in is how much we can already do by clarifying the application of existing pieces of legislation in terms of the location of liability. And we might actually get quite a long way by being able to do that, rather than having to think that there's an omission of regulation at the moment. A second area is what we can do to very rapidly deploy existing and new products to be able to understand the kind of causal weight of different sorts of decisions and different parts of who has decided what, to be able to understand liability better, because some of this is about whether you have clearly decided one way or another or deployed something that's illegal. But part of this is actually becoming more and more complex to figure out who has agency on the thing that triggers potentially illegality, and being able to understand that with a bit more granularity, I think, is partly a policy question, but it's actually in large part a product question as well. And so that's a question I'm very interested in. And then the third question I'm interested in is there are some really large startups, large funding rounds for startups that have opened up an insurance market. And I don't think that in itself is kind of an adequate outcome. But one of the things it does do is it starts to allow people to build more robust risk models of how to understand liability and outcome risk as well. And so across that chain, I think that there are three things that are very much on my mind at the moment, but it's an area that I want to try and learn a lot more.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Plenty of you will want to watch the Prime Minister's speak at 2 o'clock, and I'm sure Kanishka, you've got to get off. I hate to make these things run over time. So that's it, folks. And please just join me in thanking Kanishka. Thank you very much.